Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are. My name is Cyril Brightman. I'm the director of the English language, also the telephone noise. I'm the director of the English language desk at Yad Vashem's International Relations Division. And I'd like to welcome you all to this lecture by Dr. Naama Shik entitled Embracing Life in the Aftermath of the Holocaust. Dr. Shik received her PhD from Tel Aviv University. Her field of expertise is Jewish women in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and her dissertation was written under the supervision of Professor Shulamit Volkov. Dr. Shik has published articles on various topics related to the unique experience of Jewish women in the camps, daily life, pregnancies and births, mother-daughter relations, and the return to life. She's also published articles about the differences between testimonies and autobiographical literature published immediately after war and those created at a later stage. Dr. Shik has been working at the International School for Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem since 1999 and became the director of the e-learning department in 2005. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And I think we should say a good morning, good afternoon, a good evening in order to actually include everybody that we have here. I'm happy to be here this noon for Israel time, and we will talk today about I would say the return of mainly Jewish women to life after the Holocaust. This is of course a big description and which includes a lot of people, women. And we will, of course, not be able to deal and talk with everything, but I do want to speak about several aspects, I think, from what we term the return to life, and in this case of Jewish women. And I will share a presentation, which we will see in a second. And you can see here, actually, that we can see already from I think from the the I chose that we of course talking, I would say, about a life circle of a women's and about the influence of the Holocaust. Of course, it sounds almost I would say stupid to say the influence of the Holocaust about their life after it. Of course, there is a huge influence of the Holocaust about their life after that. And what we can see here really, it's like parts, I think, from this life circle before the Holocaust and mainly after the Holocaust. And when we're talking about what we can say, the influences of the Holocaust about women, it as goes to all Holocaust survivors, we, of course, first, we are talking, I can say, in huge descriptions, and we're talking about a lot of people, and it can be different from one survivor to a different survivor. But when we generally talking about the subject, first we really have to remember that there is a huge difference and about the influence, if we're talking about it, about concerning the question, how old were you when you, if you can call it, enter the Holocaust? What was your family position? Were you, if you were a young teenager, of course, there is a huge difference in your experience. And if you were a young mother or an older mother or grandmother, it really depends. And of course, about the experience of the Holocaust and the influence of the Holocaust that had on women after it. For example, if you didn't have children before the Holocaust, there is a huge difference if we compare it to a woman, to a mother who lost a child in the Holocaust, and when we are looking at their life after the Holocaust. And we have to, I think, to take really into consideration that when we are talking about the Holocaust influences, we are talking about, it's interesting, it was termed by Yolanda Gampel, which I'm going to quote in a second. She's an Israeli psychoanalyst, and she treated the Holocaust survivors and their children for many years. She's trauma expert, and she was referring to the Holocaust like the Holocaust is an event which of course still have its influences on our life today, and mainly she was saying that in many cases it's interesting. She's using the I would say the description of nuclear bomb, and when she was talking about the Holocaust and about the Holocaust influences, she said that the influences are still here, and we're going to have them for many years, about the people who went it through and their children and their children after it. And it doesn't mean, I always, when talking about in this introduction, it doesn't mean, of course, that people did not, women return to life. They did, of course, return to life. But we have, I think, to acknowledge the influences and of this trauma that had on their later life, of course. I chose actually to start with Ruth Klegel. Ruth Klegel, she was born in Vienna. She was, after Hitler did the Anschluss to Vienna, she was sent after a few months to Auschwitz with her mother. She was very young. She was 12. She was sent with her mother to Auschwitz. Both of them managed to go through the selection, to pass the selection and enter Auschwitz as prisoners. And they went through, I can say, the whole ordeal of the Holocaust together. It was Auschwitz, and then Death March, and then another camps, and eventually both of them were liberated. It's interesting to see Ruth Klegel, she's still alive. She, after the Holocaust, she became a German literature scholar, which is really interesting. But she did actually, she did not specialize in modern German literature. She actually ended, I think, her expertise at 18th or 19th century, and she published her memoirs twice, which is interesting, because very interesting. She was with her mother in the camp, and she published one version of her memoir when her mother was still alive, and the other version after her mother died, because there were things in her book and in her memory and in the way she remembers it and talks about it, that she feared that they will hurt her mother, and this is why she published two versions of her book. But I actually decided to begin with something which is more, if we can call it optimistic. This is here where Ruth Klegel is talking actually about the good things that we have in human beings, and here about specific human being. And we can see along the lecture that in many cases, survivors are related to the fact that if during their time in the Holocaust, during their experiences in the Holocaust, if they met someone who helped them, or someone who showed bravery, or someone who, as they were saying, did think for other persons, and of course, in the fact they didn't have to do it, they keep on talking about the fact that gave them strength and gave them all the time the feeling that they are still human beings. And Ruth Klegel is writing here, she's saying, we're not going to read everything, but she is saying, for it came out of the blue sky. Klegel was 12 at that time, and that was a selection in Auschwitz. She was in a very, very bad position at that time. Her mother was also in a very bad position, and both of them, they thought that they will be selected to go to the gas chambers. And she's talking here about a young woman who actually, that young woman was a block elder. She was a block elder, or the leader of a block. She was a Jewish. She was nominated by the Germans to do this job, and she was in charge of the block. And she, of course, was in a better position considering the other prisoners. And Klegel is talking about, and she said, the more I think about the following thing, the more astonished I am about the following thing, the more astonished I am about it, about someone making a free decision to save another person in a place which promoted the instinct of self-preservation to the point of crime and beyond. Neither psychology, she is saying, nor biology explains it. Only free will does. And this is beautiful, the way she speaks about the fact that you can in a way also keep your free will in Auschwitz too, and risking your life, getting nothing out of it, just risking your life in order to save someone else. And she's quoting here Simone Weil, who was, of course, a Jewish French Holocaust survivor who later on became a very prominent and important person and woman in the French government. And also she became to be a very feminist person. She was fighting for human rights. And she was also a writer. And Klegel is quoting Simone Weil. And she's saying Simone Weil was suspicious of particularly all literature, because literature tends to make good actions boring and evil ones interesting, thus reversing the truth, she argued. Perhaps women know more about what is good than men do, since men tend to trivialize it. In any case, Weil was right, as I learned that day in Birkenau. The good is incomparable and inexplicable as well, because it does not have a proper cause outside itself, and because it does not reach for anything beyond itself. And I think it's important to open, this kind of a lecture where we are going to talk about motherhood and about lost childhood and about women who lost children during the Holocaust and then have the courage to have more children after the Holocaust. And I think it's important also to talk about the good. Many times we talk about the Holocaust, and naturally, of course, we are talking about the question of evil and radical evil, and also about the question of how is it humanly possible. I think it's important for us still to remember about what is Klegel talking here about, this free spirit and the free will and solidarity, which is important. Charlotte Delbo was born, you can see here her picture as a prisoner. She is a non-Jewish survivor of Auschwitz. She was a writer and a theater director, and she and her husband Georges Dudach joined the French resistance. They were captured by the Gestapo. Her husband Georges Dudach he was actually murdered during his torture by the Germans. Delbo was sent with other French women to Auschwitz. She was in Auschwitz almost a year. Out of her transport of 100 women, only 45 came back to France. She began to write her memoir as early as 46, but she began to publish them only at 1976, because she was not sure in a way how people will perceive them. And she considered today to be one of what we can call it classical writer about the Holocaust and about Auschwitz in particular. She was translated into English in 1990, and her book is called Auschwitz and After. And she is asking the question about returning to life, about actually in this few words, she also talking about the collapse of the world that they knew before the Holocaust. And she's also asking the question, can you, as a Holocaust survivor, come back? And she's writing, I have returned from a world beyond knowledge, a world beyond knowledge. How can you understand a world which is beyond knowledge, and how can you transfer your experience in this world which is beyond knowledge to other people? And now she's saying, must unlearn, for otherwise I can clearly see I can no longer live. She's also talking here about what she terms in one of her trilogy, useless knowledge. This is something which is difficult for us when we are listening about or learning about the Holocaust, this term of useless knowledge, because in our world, I will say, normal world, knowledge, of course, have huge value. We are living our life due, in many cases, to knowledge. We are transferring knowledge. We're having our language and we have our knowledge. And our knowledge, in a way, our personal experiences in life and communal experiences in life, this kind of knowledge is an important human knowledge. And she's saying here, I came back from a word which is beyond knowledge. This is a word that it is important, it is difficult to understand. And you have the question, can you understand it and can you transfer it to other people? And she's saying, I have to forget this world because otherwise I can no longer live after what I saw there, what I experienced there as a human being and as a woman. I've come back from another world to this world I had not left. And I know not which one is real. Tell me. And she's asking, did I really come back from the other world? And she continues. And she's saying again, I came back from the dead. We can see that in many cases, Holocaust survivors are talking about, in many perspectives, as sometimes Jorge Semprún was writing about it, for example, that they crossed their own death and came back. And many times you ask the question, they ask the question, if you can transfer this experience, this loss, this hunger, this cold, everything to people us who were not there. And she's saying, I came back from the dead and I believed this gave me the right to speak to others. What she means is what she's saying, I came back from this world beyond knowledge, beyond human knowledge, okay, before the Holocaust. But I came back, survivors came back, and we want to talk and to transfer our experiences. And we want to speak to others, the others who are the people who were not there. And she continues, but when I found myself face to face with them, I had nothing to say because I learned over there that you cannot speak to others. Here she raises, of course, the question of what we call the oxymoron, a survivor who can't actually deliver in many experiences he or she experiences in the Holocaust because they don't have the language to do it, and we, people who are not there, don't have the language to understand it. And this is all the time this oxymoron. How do we talk, listen, and learn about the Holocaust, which comes with it, I think, at least always, a very big amount of humility. We have to be very humid, when very humble, I think, when we are listening to Holocaust survivors and we're learning about the Holocaust, because we were not there, because we were not in this other world, we were not came back from there, and we don't fully understand the language and the meaning of the language over there, because we can't understand it. And Yolanda Gampel, which I was referring in the beginning of the lecture, she calls, it's interesting, and it brings us into the subject, of course, of parenthood. She terms her book, The Parents Who Live Through Me. Her book, which the quotation is taken from there, is dealing with Holocaust survivors, sons and daughters, and what I can say, their experiences as second generation, which of course goes to the experiences of their parents. But what she's saying here, it's very important. She's saying giving a testimony is difficult for Holocaust survivor, as it is for survivor of all government violence. The possibility of testifying, and especially the possibility of being heard, is the only demand these survivors make. She's talking, of course, about the need of survivors to testify about the fact that many of them, during their imprisonment, were continually talking about the fact that they want to survive in order to testify. She also talks here about the fact that many times when they when they gave testimonies and when they wanted to talk, people did not listen and did not understand. And she continues at the same time. Here she talks about the listeners, about the people, about us who listens. At the same time, though, listening to he who was broken, to the chaos, the cruelty and crimes committed, to the laws that were obliterated. All this requires the listener to give up a degree of certainty. This is very important. We don't, I think, often think about it, about the fact that, and Dori Laub is also talking about it, about the fact that when we are listening or reading Holocaust survivor testimonies, we have to give up, as Yolanda Gampel is saying, a certain degree of certainty. And what she means it's the certainty, what seems to us, to people who are not there, the certainty of life, the normal life. I think the belief in men and in the world that we do have in a normal life, and also the certainty, and this is what I think I was talking about humble perspective to deal about the Holocaust, also the certainty about the questions that immediately, unconsciously or consciously arise in us when we are listening to Holocaust survivor, and the question what we were doing in these cases. And we are talking, as I was saying, when we're talking about, women after the Holocaust, we're talking about a circle of life, we're talking about childhood, about marriage, about motherhood, about lost socialization, and of course, about gender. I wanted to start with a short film. This is Hannah Bar-Yesha. She was 12 in Auschwitz with her mother, and she lost her mother. They entered the camp together. They were together for a few months. After a few months, because her mother were actually doing a joint, I would say, she was doing a double survival struggling, because she was trying to save Hannah as well. And her mother, of course, eventually became a Muslim man, and she was taken to the gas chamber. But and then Hannah actually had to continue and try to survive alone. And eventually she survived. And in this small passage, she's talking about their joint, if we can call it, life in a women barrack in Birkenau, a women camp.
בצריף הזה אני למדתי על המון דברים, על המון דברים על המשך חיי. אני למדתי להיות בין אנשים מבוגרים ממני, כי אני הייתי הילדה היחידה פה בצריף הזה. הייתי בת 12. אני למדתי כאן איך לרעוב, איך לסבול, איך לחיות בקור, איך לחיות ברעב אדיר, ובעיקר למדתי לחיות על יד אמא שלי, שהייתה איתי עדיין כאן אז, ואנחנו שכבנו שתינו יחד עם עוד 11 נשים על הדרגש הזה. איך שכבו כאן 13 נשים, כשאחת רצתה להסתובב, כולם היו צריכות להסתובב. ככה, כמו שאתם רואים את הקרשים הבלתי מהוקצעים האלה, ככה זה היה. וכשאימא ניסתה לפלוט את הכינים מראשי כאן, על הרצפה, כי היא פחדה שהמפקדת של הצריף תראה שיש לי כינים, היא הייתה כולה פחד, היא הייתה כולה רעדה, מכיוון שכאן זה כבר לא נמצא, על אחד העמודים האלה פה למעלה. הייתה כרזה, ושם היה כתוב, אין לוזה דיין טוט, קינה אחת המוות שלך.
Hannah Briesha is keep on talking about her life with her mother then, and again, we will be back, we will talk again about Hannah Briesha after liberation. And here we have, for example, a teen, she was 12 in the Holocaust. She lost, when we're talking about the influence of the Holocaust, and now we're talking about the teen, she lost, we have to understand, she lost everything. She lost, of course, like most of the other teens in the Holocaust. They lost their parents, their entire family. In many cases, when they survived after their parents sacrificed their life for them. And that comes, of course, when we're talking about life after the Holocaust with pangs of guilt, which goes straight to Hannah Briesha, and we will talk about it in a second. You can see in the film that she's talking the way that her mother was trying to keep her alive, and she was keep on trying to take the lice out of her hair. And Hannah, she's talking, I was 12, she hated it. And her mother was keep on trying to give her her own food. But the food in Auschwitz was so disgusting, and it was disgusting, and even though she was so hungry, she said, and I didn't want to eat it. And my mother she was only trying to keep me alive. And I was kind of fighting it because I hate when she tried to take the lice out of my hair, and I hated the food. And I was 12 and I didn't know what to do. And it was horrible. And years after that, Hannah Briesha still suffers from pangs of guilt. And she's saying about the way she behaves in Auschwitz. And the picture that we see here now, you can see these teens, they are part of the first Jewish women who was sent to Auschwitz. This is a picture from 1936. The 5 of them were sent to Auschwitz in 1942. Only 2 of the 5 you can see here survived. One of them, Margeta Schwale, wrote in 46, and we will not read everything, but she writes about this return to life and about what was lost, about the fact that, of course, at the beginning, everything was lost. Their parents, their sisters, their brothers, their community, everything. Then they lost their trust in the world, and they lost their trust in human beings. They lost their entire socialization, which is extremely important when we talk about life circle of men and women too, of course, but we are talking about women now. They lost their childhood, their adolescence, and later on they will talk about the fact that they don't know, and they lost their mothers. Of course, most of them lost their mothers and their entire family. And then through their life after the Holocaust, the struggle. How to be a woman? What is to be a woman? How to be a mother? What does it mean to be a mother? And also, thing that we don't often think about it, how to be a daughter. Because when we think about these teens who lost their parents when they were 12 or 13 or 14, you're losing in a way everything, and also how to be a daughter. And she's talking, and this is 46, she's talking immediately after liberation. We were looking ourselves, and I want to say a few. I will go back to survivors who were young in liberation, but we have to say a few words when we are talking about the influence of the Holocaust on women after the Holocaust. We have to talk about, of course, about mothers and about motherhoods, and we know that 1.5 million children were murdered in the Holocaust. Some of these children, parents, survived the Holocaust. It's not something, I think, that we can, of course, I would say, have a ladder of suffering or categorization of suffering. But when we are talking about people who lost their children during the Holocaust, and it can be in the ghettos, and it can be in hiding, and it can be everywhere, that's I think, and when we read testimonies and when we read memoirs, this is something that I will say it, I think, in understatement, something which is very difficult to heal from. And you do have the question if you can heal after losing a child. I think in many cases that you keep on living. It's a question. Also, people who after the Holocaust gave birth mother to other children. Here we have Arina B, and I guess you probably already managed to read a bit. There were no Jewish women, there were no pregnant Jewish women in Auschwitz. And in other camps. They were murdered immediately upon arrival. There were a few hundred, and probably more, probably a few thousand women who managed to conceal, or they didn't know they were pregnant upon arrival to the camps, or they managed to conceal it because they were in a very early stage of the pregnancy. But eventually the fate of a Jewish pregnant woman in the camp was bad or worst. Worst was when, the Germans were performing medical experiments with the newborns and then murdering them, and bad was the murder of the women and the child, and you have kind of practice of Jewish doctors who were doctors and midwives before the war, who were really risking their life and trying to save the life, at least the life of the mothers, because you couldn't have a Jewish children in the camps. And here we have a description of Arina B. We don't have her full name. She had to give birth in the camp, and her boy was murdered. And this testimony was given in 1990. Arina B. knew exactly, or knows, if you can call it, exactly where her child is. You can see in this testimony, she's saying, and until today, I don't know where my child is. I don't know what happened to my child. It is, of course, this detachment. And Arina B, she survived. And here, when we are talking about pregnancies and about motherhood, after the Holocaust, it's not as, I would say, happily ever after as we would like it, we would love it to be. It's so much more complicated. There are things concerning the Holocaust that are not being often discussed. For example, when we are talking about Bergen-Belsen, okay, that was a concentration camp, and then at the end of the war, at the Holocaust, it became almost kind of a death camp, because the Germans were actually, we can call it killing the camp by not, in the last month of the camp existing, they were not giving water and food, and thousands and tens of thousands of people died there. But a year after Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the British, and then it was because of the typhus, the original camp was burned, and of course all the prisoners, now survivors, were moved to a DP camp, displaced person camp, who was established next to the original place of Bergen-Belsen. And we can tell the story of Bergen-Belsen, for example, in I would say in two ways. We can say, and both of them will be correct, but we have to acknowledge the complexities in it, because a year after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, we can celebrate, and this is accurate, more than 1,000 weddings. And if I'm not misleading you, I think after a year we can say that the 100 Jewish children were born in the camp. So we can talk about it in a way as, you know, the Jewish people, I would say, as the phoenix raises from the fire and rebuilds itself, which is correct. But it's more complex, because when we are talking about many of these marriages, they are not marriages from, I would say, our normal life, when usually, I guess, you get married out of love or other reason of falling in love. And many of the marriages in the DP camps were what is termed in the research as survivor marriage, marriage out of huge loneliness. I'm not saying, and of course it's important, I was actually kind of disclaiming in the beginning of the lecture, saying that we are talking about so many people here, and of course not all of the marriages of Holocaust survivors, or especially marriages in the DP camps, very early marriages, are survivor marriages or loneliness marriages, out of loneliness, but many of them are. And another thing which is not being discussed a lot when we talk about the Holocaust, I was talking about the fact that, of course, unfortunately, and this is horrible, many people lost their children in the Holocaust, and some of the parents survived. And you know, I was just talking that a year after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, we have the 100 Jewish children was born. And this is something which is happy, it is. But the thing that are not being spoken so much is the fact that there were a lot of women who, or many women who after the Holocaust didn't want to have more children. Even if they lost children in the Holocaust, out of their trauma, out of the question, what will happen to my child if I will have another child? And here we have Arina testimonial. She is saying, I was lucky. I find my husband after the war, and finally we made it home to Germany. They were Jews from Germany. And she's saying, and I was afraid to have a child. He wanted a family, and I said, for what? Again, it's gonna happen again. They're gonna kill our children. I always afraid. And she said, and I got pregnant with my second child. The first she lost in Auschwitz. And I was afraid again. And I said to my husband, this is something which is very, very difficult to us to read and to hear, right? She said, I don't want to have a child anymore. I hated to be in Germany. I hate all the Germans. I can't stand these stones covered with blood. Everything is in blood. And I was so, you can see her anxiety through the testimony. And finally she's saying, and eventually she's having, it's difficult to read it. And finally, and look how to get rid of it. And I went and I get rid of it. Yeah, and it's so difficult, of course, to us to read it. But for her, from her perspective, it's unbearable in many ways to have another child after the Holocaust. And eventually they're immigrating to the United States, and they're having two sons and their grandparents. But also at the end of her testimony, she's saying, it is not a completely happy end. Yeah, she's saying when she's been asked, and she's already having children and grandchildren, she said that sometimes I feel like I'm stoned. Sometimes I feel like inside, I still feel like a stone. And I think I will skip this film because I want to say a few words about, I just want to conclude this one. There were not single, like quite many, I think, women who lost their children after the Holocaust and didn't want to have more children, or were performing an abortion because they couldn't bear this fear again that their children will be murdered again. And most of them did remarried, because of course in most cases they also lost their husbands, and brought I don't even know how to say, more children, or gave birth to other children, and a lot of happiness came with it. I'm not saying it's not, but we have to remember, of course, that there are scars, which they became scars, but I don't think they ever really heal. And I want to say a few words about the teens, about the one who were youngsters during the Holocaust and didn't lost children, but lost their mothers. And Judith Jagerman, she was 12, and she was from Prague. She was 12 when she was sent with her parents to Auschwitz. Her mother, really, she did this heroic struggle for life in order to keep Jagerman, who was 12, and her sister, who was, sorry, a bit older than her, alive. But eventually, as in the case of Hannah Bar-Yesha, because it's almost impossible, of course, to struggle for survival to two people. And eventually she became a Muslim man, and she was elected in one of the selections to the gas chambers. Judith Jagerman, after liberation, saying, I'm completely lost faith in adults. And that was even before I had the chance of trusting them. When we are talking about the teens, and I was talking about this lost socialization, loss of childhood, that of course include this basic thing of faith in adults and faith in humanity. And they, almost all of them, here, and this is a quotation, I want to say a few words about it, from Hannah Bar-Yesha, who is actually, she's coming to Auschwitz, and she's trying to apologize. You can read it. She wanted to go back to Auschwitz and to apologize to her mothers. And as you can see here, she went in 1990, actually, she went with the Yad Vashem guide. The first time, Hannah Bar-Yesha, she went to Majdanek, and then she Auschwitz, and on the gas chambers, that was difficult and very touching, of course. She's saying, Mother, Mom, I can feel you here. I can feel you. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. Most of the teens who survived, who enter, I would say, the Holocaust at the age between 10 to 12, and then liberated at the age of 14 and 15, or 17 or 18, they got married very early, many of them at a very early stage. You can see they got early, many of them got married at the age of 17 and 18. As you can see here, Eva Gal, she is saying, but in 46, 47, anyone who was there was looking for someone, just to be together with someone, to be a couple. And I was already 19, almost 20, so I thought I will stay a spinster and I must get married. And they are getting married very young, and also bringing children very young. Judith Jagerman is talking here about, she gave birth to her child when she was 19. She said, and we are asking ourselves the question about this kind of early marriages and kind of early giving birth to children, to those who were teens during the Holocaust. And we think here, we know actually about, from many perspectives, that there is a need, as they are saying, to be belonged to someone. They lost everything. There is a need to have someone of your own, which are your children, and in many cases it brings happiness. But it also, of course, brings complexities, because as I was saying, they don't know how to be a mother. To be a mother is something that actually we learned mainly through socialization. We are looking at our mothers, we are looking at our parents, we are living in a family or in a community or in a tribe, or we are living in a place where we can actually, this is socialization. We are watching it, we are learning it. And also, when we're giving our own children, usually we have this I can even call it a community of women. We have our mothers who are helping us, and we have, and directing us and explaining us. And this is kind of our, how do you know to be a mother? And we are going back to them, this question, how to be a mother, how to raise a child. And of course, also the fact that as they are saying here I had great joy with that child. In many cases, she is saying, and you can see what she says here, I just cried at a child, I needed another child, she wanted another child. And here she's saying, I remained the child. When in many cases, when we are talking about the self of these teens, it's difficult to rebuild, I would say, a full self. When you know how to be a mother, how to be a daughter, how to raise a child. And I want to conclude, because we have to conclude with most of the women who were teens and then young women who lost children or didn't lose children, and elderly women who lost children, most of them rebuilt their life. And I think I don't often use this term or word, but I think in a very heroic way. And I do use the word heroic because you did have to be brave in order to bring another children to the world. You have to be brave, you have to believe, you have to regain your belief in humanity and human beings. You have to regain your belief, you have to gain, not regain, a belief in yourself as a woman, if you're young, that you can have children, that nobody will murder your children, that you will have the ability to raise them, and that you will have the ability to give them joy and happiness and good life, what we want to give to our children. And you were brave enough to remarry, and you were brave enough to re-believe in love and to re-believe really in joy and to re-believe in life. And here we have, for end, we have this, I think it's a beautiful quote of Ada Puttersman. She was a Holocaust survivor from Auschwitz, and really, like most of Holocaust survivors, she lost everything. And she's saying, she wrote it, she gave it in a testimony to Yad Vashem, and she was saying, this is in early 2000, I'm a hero, I don't believe it myself, but I had such a sense, I was so nimble. To this day, I remember everything, I live and I can tell, and I'm happy. And many other survivors are talking so much about rebuilding their families and about the fact that this is a source for strength and happiness. And Charlotte Delbo, which we began with, we have two pictures. This picture, I really, really love it. It's a picture of a Jewish woman. This is in Bergen-Belsen after liberation. She survived Auschwitz. And you can see, of course, she's still very thin, but her hair grew up a bit. And you have this, actually, to me, I don't know, beautiful, beautiful smile. And the sun, it's really like this new beginning is coming. And this is Charlotte Delbo after the Holocaust, of course. And Charlotte Delbo is actually in this short poem, she's writing to Holocaust survivor, female Holocaust survivor themselves, and about the return to life. And I think this is about how to gain life again. And she's writing, I beg you, do something. Learn a dance step, something to justify your existence, something that gives you the right to be dressed in your skin, in your body hair. Learn to walk and to laugh, because it would be too senseless after all for so many to have died, but while you live doing nothing with your life. Thank you very much for listening.